Thank you, Professor. My question is about the results of your model. Your model shows a complex and interconnected system and structure. And structure reaches to micro levels and macro levels of activities. Do you think that multisystemic crisis can be managed through the complex and interconnected structures of the system?
Maybe. We need to get more sophisticated about what we mean by complexity and connectivity. And so in a general sense, I'd say that there are forms of connectivity and complexity that may actually make us less prone to crisis and forms that make us more prone to crisis. There is a tendency in many of these conversations to just lump all connectivity together and say it's either all good or all bad, or more is better or more is worse. And we do the same kind of thing with complexity. Now, our standard response to crisis is generally has been to make systems more complex. So in the United States, you can make an argument that one of the reasons that we had this financial crisis in 2008 is because of that long-term process of deregulation, which was supposedly a simplification of markets. And we've responded to the crisis by adding a lot of complexity in terms of new regulations to prevent that kind of crisis from ever happening again. And there are proposals for new international, in fact, more than proposals, new international rules and regulations governing, for instance, things like banking reserves have been introduced. And that's our standard response. But it might actually be the case that the best thing to do to prevent this kind of phenomenon is, well, first of all, to deal with some of these underlying stresses, right, which are making the whole system very prone to crisis. And secondly, reduce the connectivity of certain kinds within the system so that if you do get a systemic crisis in one part of it, it doesn't cascade into the whole system. And it may be reducing certain kinds of connectivity. So it might involve something like introducing a financial transactions tax, what's commonly called a Tobin tax, to reduce the incentives for traders to do this global arbitrage, trying to get, you know, 1/100th of a cent on the dollar or 100th of a cent on an asset in nanoseconds through high-frequency trading, because it'll get taxed away. And what you're doing by introducing a tax like that is you're actually reducing the tightness of the coupling in the system. So again, to answer your question, it could be that some of the answer is to introduce more complexity of various kinds, but it could also be that what you need to do is deal with these underlying stresses, and that may or may not involve adding more complexity. And it could also involve actually reducing complexity in the form of loosening coupling in certain parts of the system, so that if a crisis does happen, it doesn't cascade through the system as fast as they seem to be cascading now. I mean, you can imagine telling the same kind of story about, say, avian flu pandemic, right? It was SARS developed near Hong Kong and reached Toronto in a week and shut our healthcare system down. It was lucky it wasn't very infectious. It was either very infectious and wasn't very virulent. If you want to have a sleepless night, watch Contagion. It's a good movie. They got the science right. Yeah.
I have a question about how you see this model compares with chaos theory, which was popular a while ago, how the butterfly
well, so chaos theory is often misunderstood and misrepresented. So chaos theory is principally about the idea of sensitivity to initial conditions, that small things can have a big impact, sometimes within systems. And that's one idea within a larger panoply of ideas in complex systems theory. Now, sometimes, in some places, complex systems can be sensitive to initial conditions, and sometimes they aren't. It's one of the things that makes complex systems really interesting. Chaos doesn't exist all the time. This actually isn't chaos, right? There may be high sensitivity to initial conditions in some places. So one of the suggestions here is that you're getting so much underlying pressure building up in the system that a proximate trigger doesn't have to be very much at all. And it can be any one of many, many different things. I'm suggesting in the United States for the economic crisis, it was crossing that threshold from $3.95 to $4, which is a very important cultural and psychological threshold in the United States. And it maybe caused just a slice of the population living in those exurbs to suddenly decide, I can't afford my mortgage anymore, or I'm not going to buy that house. You know? And all of a sudden the developers who are leveraged up to here and have built these huge tracts of houses that have to sell, find that they can't pay their debts because nobody's buying the houses. So a very small thing potentially, in a situation where you've got enormous stress already in the system and a lot of the coping mechanisms overloaded, could push the system into a crisis state. So that is sensitivity to initial conditions. And so there may be elements of chaos at various points here, but there are other things that are characteristic of complex systems. In particular, what you could call multiple equilibria. It's not just the small thing flips a system from one state to the other, but you have alternative states available to the system. You have a situation of stability, a situation of crisis. And that's also characteristic of complex systems. And if you looked really closely at what was going on in the background here, you'd probably find all kinds of positive reinforcing feedback loops and things like that. So chaos or sensitivity to initial conditions is just one part of the story.
I can ask for a clarification.
Yep.
As soon as I saw this, I started thinking about how to operationalize your research. And I was thinking about like how multiple factors, what kind of symbiotic relationship they have. So one's failure simultaneously ends up into failure of the other ones. But then again, when I saw the proximate triggers, it basically made it more difficult because
you can't operationalize those.
Yes.
Because they can be anything.
So the clarification is you're not looking into the approximate triggers, but you're looking into factors that overload the systems in time.
Well, the plan that we've laid down for our research is, first of all, to get this empirically grounded and quantitative in many respects, tabular representation of crises affecting humankind over the last century. Crises above, say, affecting 10 million people, something like that, or some proportion of the human population, substantial proportion of the human population. Might be equivalent to, say, right now we have 7 billion people on the planet, 700 million is 10%, 70 million is 1%. Let's say we take a 1% threshold. Anything that affects more than 1% of the human population will end up in our table, going back a century. And then what we will do is we'll look at that. First of all, we'll look at changes in frequency and changes in magnitude. But we'll also start to take a selection of those cases and tell stories, get down into them and tell stories about them, the way I did a bit for the energy financial crisis in 2008, and see if the character of crisis is changing over time, the individual crises. That will be at that point a configurative exercise, in the sense that we will be telling a story about each event and then comparing the stories to see whether they're similar or different in fundamental ways. And if it turns out that, you know, earlier crises didn't exhibit this, for instance, intersystemic character, and especially didn't exhibit this large-scale global cascading effect at the end, then we can legitimately publish and say the proceedings of the National Academy that things have changed. There seems to be something different.
Well, what about like something happened in last century, last century, for instance, the Spanish flu in 1918 or 1919. In excess of 20 to 30 million people died.
Well, right. So that's why we actually need the full list to see if there's been a change in frequency. We're not saying that something like this never happened before. The question is whether it's happening more now than it did before. Okay? Yeah, okay. Good question.
My initial gut reaction after hearing you is that there's actually less crisis today than
Well, Steven Pinker would think so.
in the past. And, you know, and I think about, you know, the life that my grandparents had, you know, growing up in the 20s and then the Great Depression and World War II. And, you know, life was hard, you know, in that. And there were, you know, it was a very chaotic time in the world system. And so I'd be fascinated to see your data, because my sense is that the world is actually, despite everything you described, the financial crisis, that we're actually more stable today than before.
possible that you're right. It's also possible that's what's happened is we've got a change in the shape of the power law curve. In other words, we've got a flattening of the tail. So it's like this. It's extremity of crisis out there, right? Or severity of crisis, frequency here. And we have fewer really bad crises, but we have a higher rate of extreme crisis. In other words, the tail gets longer, right? It gets thinner and longer. So that may be a function, for instance, of the connectivity within the system, that when something goes, it affects a big chunk of the human population.
And that's my second point, that it not only affects a big portion of the population, but it affects them disproportionately. So that, with the food crisis,
Yep.
Prices went up here, but it caused revolutions in Haiti. People started eating sand because.
Yep. Yep.
So I mean, one of the things with the crisis too is that there is this disproportionate effect.
Yeah, and we've been concerned about that, especially if we want to take sort of a threshold, 10% decrement in human well-being within a year, and then sort of count everybody that's above that has a bigger impact than that threshold. And what happens then is you lose a lot of the discrimination among the differential impact. And I think that's an issue. And it's something we'll think about. But at the same time, you've got to remember when you're going back a century, there's not a lot of data about what happened in places like Armenia in, when was it? 1918, right? And there's a lot of dispute about what happened in Armenia in 1918, even if you can find the data. So a lot of this is going to have to be kind of quick and dirty. We don't want to try to press the data too hard. But we want to, nonetheless, I think it would be useful just to answer exactly your kind of questions. Are things getting better or worse? Or when maybe on average we're better off, but when something goes, it really goes? We don't really know. I think it's worth getting that information.
I was just thinking, as soon as you said these 5 crises, it's really depressing because it seems like we're all going to eventually do something really bad to ourselves. But I think it's one of my friends in government is really fond of saying that once you've seen on the inside, you're either really depressed that it works that way or really impressed that it works at all. Like, really impressed that we don't do this all the time. So I think when you're looking at this, I'm wondering, are you going to look at crises that could have been longer? I mean, you mentioned the Fukushima thing, that it actually could have been a lot worse.
Yep.
And why
it wasn't. Yep.
I guess that's
yeah, is there management going on in the system? Exactly. In fact, one of our co-authors has said you got to look at the counterfactuals. You got to ask the what ifs. What could have been worse? What could have been better? And I think those are completely legitimate questions. I mean, my background, one of the reasons I probably left the synchronous failure idea behind, Andrew, is because of my intuition too. On the other hand, I also have this intuition that things have changed. And I look at the fact that it's almost 30 degrees outside in March, and I look at the vulnerability of the global food system to tightly coupled, low slack global grain system. It's extremely vulnerable to relatively small shortfalls in food production. And I think we're really skating along the edge. It may turn out that what we've done in terms of complex systems theory is we've improved the homeostatic maintenance mechanisms of the system to keep us within the bowl. And we've raised the walls. But if we get bounced outside, we got a lot further to fall. So as long as we can keep managing this system, and this is something, it's sort of the feeling you get from the global financial system. You sort of wonder, what happens if Europe goes? What happens if we start to see a string of sovereign defaults? There actually isn't a fallback at that point because most governments don't have the fiscal capacity at this point to step in, And you wonder, okay, if we go over that wall, if we get bumped out of this bowl, we've unloaded all our ammunition. And if we go outside next time into a new equilibrium, where are we going to go? And that could be something out at the end of the tail. So that's kind of the other background intuition I have. And to the extent that we can get a bit of a handle on that, I think we would be doing something useful. That make sense? So thank you very much.